Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, everybody. I am so excited for this week's episode because I adore my guest, Jacqui, and I think this topic is incredibly important. Nutrition Research Unveiled, because we are going to be breaking down the complex world of nutrition research. So if you've ever been confused by conflicting diet headlines, you're not alone, first off, and nutrition research aims to help us understand how different foods impact our health, but the process isn't always straightforward. From small sample sizes to biases and misinterpreted data, the field is full of challenges that can lead to mixed messages. That's what we're going to be looking at. What does nutrition research really tell us? What does it not tell us? And how can we learn to read between the lines and to make sense of it all? Because this is a very complex topic, especially when it comes to understanding the terms like absolute versus relative risk, which can often be confusing without visuals. So if you'd like to follow along, please be sure to check out the episode blog linked in the show notes. And let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, everybody, I am here with my dear friend, Jacqui, and we are connecting from across the world. So freaking cool. So, before I hand off the mic, we connected on Instagram about 3 years ago. We're both extremely passionate about empowering women to understand and how to support their bodies at every life stage. And, we focus on nutrient-dense foods, whole food nutrition, and going against the grain with most wellness trends, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely.
So please introduce yourself to the listeners and feel free to share anything about your journey that kind of led you to, being where you are today. And then we'll dive into some of this more nutrition research.
Thanks so much, Megan, and thanks for having me on your podcast. So, hi, everyone. My name is Jacqui, and I am a women's wellness coach. I have always been fascinated with nutrition my whole life. I remember when I was a little girl, I would read nutrition labels. I remember sitting at the breakfast table, reading the side of the cereal boxes, being fascinated with this iron and vitamin A and vitamin C and zinc. And it just really fascinated me. But I've also always been quite a maths geek. So I love numbers. I love analyzing things. So combining those two interests is what eventually led me to studying biostatistics. So biostatistics is the analysis of health data, basically. And when you study biostats, you learn a lot about clinical trials. So how to set them up, how to conduct them, how to collect data, how to analyze the data, how to write up the data. So yeah, studying biostats is basically studying clinical trials. And I loved it. I found it very interesting. I did my master's research in modeling childhood growth outcomes based on prenatal risk factors, which, that's a topic I'm very passionate about. I love prenatal nutrition. I think it's so important. And it's definitely something that I'm extremely interested in. Following my master's, I worked in the health and life insurance industry for a while, which is interesting work. And I mean, there's so much health data that you get to work with. But I found that the corporate world is definitely not for everyone. The corporate world, it's demanding, it's stressful, and the insurance industry itself, I have some moral issues with. That's a topic for another day. So I knew that I really wanted to work with people and helping their nutrition. I wanted to work one-on-one with people. I wanted to be more involved in helping people get healthy. And so I started studying part-time to get my nutritional therapy qualification. And once I had that, I said, okay, I'm out of here, out of the corporate world. And I started working with women one-on-one to help them with their nutrition. My particular target market is usually women struggling with hormonal health challenges, because that's what I struggled with a lot myself. And I found that there was just a lack of support, lack of understanding, a lot of gaslighting by the medical industry. And so I knew I wanted to be an advocate for those women and help them realize that with nutrition and lifestyle changes, you can support your hormone health. You don't have to go on synthetic hormones. And so that's what led me to where I am today. I think that my background in statistics has been so valuable because a lot of my clients come to me with, these studies like, what about this? Should I be eating this? This study says this. Oh my gosh, I'm going to die if I eat this.
Yeah.
And having that background in clinical trials and research just helps me to evaluate this research and help put people at ease when they come to me with these studies, put things into context. So I think the combination of sort of my background and what I'm doing now has really served me well. And I hope that I can help clients with that knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, you do a great job breaking it down on your blogs and on your Instagram posts, which is how we connected, because I, got off birth control, the IUD, after 10 years, and no one told me that. They say, oh, you'll be able to get pregnant right away, or, my husband and I ultimately can't get pregnant. But in the beginning of the journey, I didn't know that. And I also had no idea what a journey I was in for understanding how the birth control had worked, suppressing my progesterone with the hormones on top of my diet culture trends of my over-exercising, my under-eating, my extremely low-fat diet. And so you really helped me with education on not only understanding the statistics and nutritional approach, which I eat that up for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but also helping me navigate my hormone balancing journey, which you were navigating as well, because you're on the journey with us while also able to process the most complex information. So you're like an expert, but you're also down here in the trenches. And I really appreciate that. And you communicate really well. And so before we move on, I wanted to say, in the episode about Germany medicine, we talked about the beginning of the clinical trials. Mesmerism is this, basically the beginning of hypnosis. And I talked a lot about pseudoscience and self-help. Not that I want to discount all the power of our thoughts. In 1784, there was a royal commission led by Benjamin Franklin and Antonio Lavoisier. And it was basically to establish are Mesmer's claims about this integrative force that we can control through hypnosis real? Because it was stirring up such crazy social unrest. And this was put together by the king. The king was like, you have to figure this out, get to the bottom of it. And this investigation was actually what led to the beginning of controlled clinical trials. I had no idea, but I was like, that is so cool, because I've always been interested in debunking some of the pseudoscience. And then I love clinical trials in some ways because I do think they help, but then it also is important to understand how to debunk them. And I just thought that was crazy because I love history. So I'll send that to you. And that's what you're going to really help us break down, is that nutritional studies aren't unhelpful, but depending on how they're presented, they can be misrepresented and can misguide us and can spread into fear and fear mongering or supporting corporate lobbyist profits, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's difficult. So you highlighted a couple things. So in regards to the reliability of nutrition research, a lot of studies, not all of them, use food frequency questionnaires. Basically, what did you eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? I'm assuming trying to assess dietary habits. Yet I know from my personal training experience, my clients struggle very much with food logs, remembering what they eat. And that's okay, because we all struggle with memory and then also interpreting what we ate. So given you and I's, both of our experience firsthand in our own client work, and then with your experience in studying statistics, what's up with this? The variability of the data, how does this affect the outcomes? Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, so a lot of nutrition research is epidemiological research, which is monitoring population level trends, basically. And why this tends to form most of the nutrition studies is because to do a controlled clinical trial in nutrition is extremely difficult. You can't lock thousands of people up in a lab somewhere and then feed them an exactly controlled diet for 10 years and see what's going to happen to them. It's just impossible. So controlled clinical trials in nutrition research tend to be quite short term, which, that has some disadvantages. So for longer term studies to see how food trends impact health and disease long term, we tend to look at population trends, epidemiological studies. And to collect data for that, we need to rely on basically surveys, population level surveys, and then, disease statistics. So what they'll often do is they'll get study participants to fill in for surveys, including food frequency questionnaires, and then they'll monitor them over the next couple of years. So one of the main issues with food frequency questionnaires is that it's often done when they recruit participants right at the beginning, and then they'll do that single food frequency questionnaire at the beginning of a study and then monitor these people for the next 10 years and then say, oh, people that ate more red meat were more likely to die of heart attack or whatever. But I mean, how many people will keep that same diet for the next 10 years? I'm sure you've changed your diet many times over the last 10 years. So that's one of the problems. It's not all research. Some research will take food frequency questionnaires from participants at regular intervals, like every few months, every few years. But a lot of the times it's a single questionnaire that's being done. So that's one of the issues. Another issue is, like you said, it's very difficult to recall your food. So they'll usually do a 24-hour food recall. So they'll ask participants what they ate over the exactly last 24 hours. But then they'll do the food frequency questionnaire, which asks questions such as, how many times a week do you eat red meat? How many times a week do you eat an apple? How many times a week do you eat green veggies? And so using both those two metrics sort of helps them to validate the data. But you can imagine how many inconsistencies and errors that come about from that type of survey. Even just ask yourself those questions and you'll really have to sit there for a while trying to think of it. So I've been part of the data collection team of a study before. When I was in university, I was helping out with a research study, and I volunteered to be part of the data collection team. So I've been there when they've done these food frequency questionnaires and just seeing that confusion on people's face, trying to think of, how many times a week they eat certain foods. And I mean, a lot of people also can't or don't necessarily know the difference or the nuances between foods. Like, I mean, most people don't know that there's a difference between, say, butter and margarine. Like, a lot of people don't know that there's actually a difference between those, and that's quite a big deal. You and I know that that's quite a big deal, but most people don't. They'll say something like, how many times a week do you eat a burger? And I'm like, well, I eat a burger every week, but it's my grass-fed, bunless burger with my sweet potato wedges.
Right.
It's, compared to someone eating Burger King once a week, it's very, very different. But those two foods will be clumped together in the same category. Then recalling your portion size, that's wildly inaccurate. People, even a health conscious person isn't necessarily aware, are they eating a cup of rice? Are they eating half a cup of rice? Are they eating 2 cups of rice? People don't generally measure their food. So there's all these different issues. Then the person collecting the data, they also might not be conveying the questions properly. They might have certain biases, so they might press for certain information that they think is necessary, which can sometimes interfere with results. And to give you an example just of how much variance you can find in these food frequency questionnaires, there's a data set called the NHANES data set. It's a very, very comprehensive nutrition data set. It's in America. It stands for the National Health and Nutrition Survey. And it's been going for many, many, many years. They do frequent food frequency questionnaires on the participants. They collect health data. They collect like blood markers, updated quite often. So it's a very comprehensive data set, and a lot of research is done on it. A few years ago, a group of researchers published a paper in a very high-end journal. It's called Cell Metabolism, the Journal of Cell Metabolism. They published findings from the NHANES data that said that increased protein intake was associated with higher all-cause mortality and higher incidence of cancer and diabetes. And they said that if you replace some of your animal-based proteins with plant-based proteins, you reduce that risk significantly. And then another group of researchers who was very familiar with the NHANES data looked at this and said, this can't be right. This other group of researchers was quite heavily focused on protein research, and they decided to try and replicate the result. And what they found was that the original researchers were using what they call the day one food frequency data, or the day one food intake data, and just using that on its own. Whereas this other group of researchers, they use what's called usual food intake. Usual food intake is done using a statistical model that takes day 1 and day 2 food intake along with other biomarkers, and it's sort of a statistical model to determine someone's usual food intake. And they repeated the study with that, and they didn't find that association. They didn't find that animal protein was associated with higher all-cause mortality. So the exact same data set, the exact same question that someone's asking, 2 completely different results. So that just starts to bring up something that we're going to discuss as well, is bias.
Right.
You can find what you're looking for in the data.
Yes, and we all have bias. Like there's like I've have to look that within myself. It's like there's nothing that's actually non-biased, and science never says anything because the scientists themselves have to interpret the data.
Exactly.
And so it's just part of how the scientific method works. It's something we have to acknowledge within ourselves and always just try to seek intellectual humility. And so you're right, that does like head right into this concept of relative risk. So we're going to say, if you consume this food, then you have a 33% increased risk of XYZ. And so it can be really alarming. And that's what you were saying in the beginning. My clients will come to me with this. And so can you elaborate a little bit more on the difference between, and we'll see this also with like drugs. They'll say like the risk of this. And so can you break that down? It's not just in nutrition, about relative risk and absolute risk, and how that distinction can lead to confusion trying to interpret nutrition studies. We'll focus specifically on nutrition studies though for your answer.
Yeah, so the sort of headlines love to use relative risk. It makes the risk sound more intense than it really is. So let's use an example. Let's say that you see this headline that says taking omega-3 supplements reduces your risk of heart attack by 30%. And you say, wow, 30%, I'm going to head out and buy my omega-3s. Obviously, I want to reduce my heart attack risk by 30%. But then if you look at the actual paper, what you might see is, say there were 2,000 participants and 1,000 participants got the omega-3 supplements and 1,000 participants got a placebo. And what they found was in the placebo group, 10 people got a heart attack. And in the omega-3 group, 7 people got a heart attack. That means that there was a 1% risk in the placebo group and a 0.7 risk in the omega-3 group. So the relative risk increase or decrease by taking omega-3 is 30%. So the people that took the omega-3 supplements were 30% less likely to get a heart attack. But let's look at the actual risk. The actual risk is 1% minus 0.7%, which is 0.3%. So that means that for every 100 people that take omega-3 supplements, only 0.3 people are lower incidence of heart attack. So it's actually a tiny, tiny risk difference. So the absolute risk should always be quoted alongside the relative risk. So they should say something like, this paper found that there was a 30% reduced risk of heart attack from taking omega-3, but the actual risk difference was 0.3. So we need to, that really needs to be taken into account to really understand what the actual risk difference is. So looking at how many participants were there, how many incidents of the disease or whatever the outcome is they're looking for, it's important to know those numbers.
Yeah, and that can be really difficult for the average consumer to take the time to find the article. Typically, it's not even always linked. Sometimes they will, like let's say we read a newspaper highlighting a new study, but that doesn't even mean the study is hyperlinked. And then that means you have to go and know how to read them. And honestly, I read them and I've been doing that, but I can't even dissect the same amount of high level information that you can with your background. And so it does put all of us, we're underserved if we don't really know how to utilize that information. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to try to break down this understanding between absolute risk and relative risk. And maybe when you see statistics, you'll start to see the difference there. And, and I'll link, I have some information in a blog and a post that I'll make sure I link all that for folks who want to read more about it. Because that's kind of leads into this third question I wanted you to break down, the concept of statistically significant. Say that 5 times fast, my friends, which sounds very impressive when you hear it, but it also can be misleading in nutritional research. So why this term? Despite it's widely used, we hear it often, it might not provide such a strong case of causation. Like you do this, it causes this. You often might hear, listeners, correlation doesn't mean causation. We hear that a lot in research. So, what does that mean and related to food and health?
Yeah, so like you said, you often hear the word, the results were statistically significant, and it sounds super impressive. You think, oh wow, if it's statistically significant, it must be important, right? But yeah, the term is used. You need to understand what it actually means. So if we use an example, let's say that the research question was, does red meat cause cancer? Let's say that's what the researchers were setting out to answer. In that, you have to define a null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis would be red meat doesn't cause cancer. So you'd go out and collect your data of people's red meat intake and cancer incidence and everything, and you do your statistical modeling, and you find that there is a statistically significant association. And that means that the p-value, which we can define now, the p-value is less than 0.05. It's defined then as statistically significant. So what people often think is that if a p-value is 0.05, it means that there was a 95% chance that red meat did cause cancer. But that's not what it means. That's not what the p-value means. We can't interpret it like that. What the p-value means is that there was a 0.05 chance or a very small probability that we observed this data if the null hypothesis was true. So if red meat does cause cancer, then the probability of observing this data would be quite low. So therefore, we say, okay, the relationship between red meat and cancer is statistically significant. So another way of thinking about it is saying, well, we can't not say that there's any link between red meat and cancer. That's basically all you can conclude, is you can just say, well, there isn't no link. But you can't say that there is a link. You can't say that there's a high probability of a link. You can just say, well, this data shows that there isn't necessarily no link. So people misinterpret that and they go, wow, there's a strong chance that red meat causes cancer. But that's not what a statistically significant result is saying at all. So it gets completely misinterpreted. And the Statistical Society has actually warned about this repeatedly. If you go look at papers published in like statistics journals, not like health journals, statistics journals, there are loads of papers looking at the flaws of p-values, the flaws of statistical significance. But because it is the standard practice in health research, it gets used, and it gets used without the proper context and nuance and understanding of what it actually means.
Yeah, so it's almost like we could almost say, because, in Taste of Truth Tuesdays, we're all about looking at how dogma and like rigid ideologies govern almost every area of expertise, and how if you're an actual truth seeker, you're eventually going to come up against these walls if you want to challenge the status quo, because evidence is kind of pushing you in a different direction. So are you truly aligning with the dogma? And so that's not necessarily the problem 100% with p-values, right? It just happens to be what's used. It doesn't mean it's dogmatically used, but because it's complex, it's hard to actually fully appreciate what it's saying.
Exactly. So there's definitely a place for it. But what I would advise people to say is, if there is a low p-value, so the result is statistically significant, look at that as, okay, that's a potential hypothesis there. That's something that there might be a link there. But that's all. You can't make a conclusive statement using that. It's not a conclusive evidence. In statistics, you can only reject or do not reject the null hypothesis. So you can only say that we found that there's no link, or we didn't find that there's no link. But you can never say we found that there is a link. So that's the thing. You're either saying there's no link or there's not no link. But it's different from saying that there is a link. And yeah, another problem with the p-value is what's often referred to as p-hacking. So people can manipulate results until they get a low p-value. And that's often done. So, I mean, as a statistics student, you do this all the time because you want this result. And I remember doing this in university with a lot of my projects. You play around with your data, you include or exclude different variables until you get this low p-value, and you're like, aha, I've proved it. It's statistically significant. But if you include, different variables, you might find that, that variable is no longer significant because now a better variable explains that relationship better. So depending on what variables you include in your model, depending on certain parameters you include in your model, you can sort of hack your way to a significant result.
Yeah, which, kind of ties me to the last thing that I want to talk about before we head into practical tips, because it's kind of like a heady conversation. And, a lot of the listeners are going to be like, okay, so what can I do? Give me some tips and tools. So we will. The last thing, though, is we talked a little bit about biases and how it's you can't be non-biased. So can you explain a little bit more about, that's kind of what we were saying. If you have a goal, you can tweak it to get what you want. That is a bias. Mm-hmm. That is a preconceived notion. A lot of people will have a preconceived understanding. And then that's where I've realized as a researcher, I want to make sure I'm proving myself wrong, not right. Mm-hmm. That at least head me in the better direction than trying to have confirmation bias. So, financial or ideological bias, those will play a role in shaping outcomes and interpretation of these studies. So can you explain a little bit more about that before we head into the practical tools and tips?
Yeah, so financial bias, I think, is a huge one, unfortunately, in nutrition research. I mean, who is going to fund a nutrition paper? It's big corporations that have money. I mean, who is funding the nutrition paper on just, a healthy farm to table type of diet? No one is interested in funding that. That's the problem, is that it's big industries funding nutrition research. So that's the first issue. And like I said, results can be manipulated and you can find what you're looking for. But let's just say hypothetically, and it does happen oftentimes that an independent body will do the analysis. So that's the ideal situation, is that you have this research question. Let's say, think of whatever, the seed oil industry, canola oil they say, okay, it does canola oil reduce heart attack. They should technically hand that over to a completely independent research body and say, you collect the data, you analyze the data, and you come back to us with the results. So let's just hypothetically say that was the case, that, it was completely independent. There was no funding interfering with the results. The thing is that the researchers themselves, they still have some bias of what they think the results are going to be. So even if they try act completely independent, your bias plays into the way you collect data. If you think about it, if you believe a certain outcome, there's different variables that you will ask study participants compared to if you didn't think that those variables mattered. So it still plays in. I think even if you try to be completely unbiased, the way you collect the data, the way you look at the data, if you think of what am I going to look for in this data, it's fueled by what you think you should be finding in that data. So it's so hard to be completely biased. And that's where the sort of ideological bias comes in. What you think the results will be, that influences how you look at the results, unfortunately. And yeah, I think that maybe the way to get around that would be to get a team with different views. But I doubt that happens in practice. Most of the times the research team probably all sort of agree on what the desired outcome is. And then another big area of bias is what they call healthy user bias. So healthy user bias is based on the idea that, let's say 10, 20 years ago, research came out that eating cholesterol-rich foods is bad. So eating eggs, eating red meat. Who then went and lowered their cholesterol intake? People who care about their health, right? People who care about their health, who exercise, who don't smoke, who, eat other healthy foods. They went and stopped eating eggs and stopped eating red meat. Who carried on eating that? People that didn't care about their health, people that smoke, drink, whatever, go, don't sleep well, whatever. So years later, 10 years later, you're collecting all this data. Obviously, the people with less egg consumption, less red meat consumption have better health outcomes. But it's not necessarily because of those foods. It's because they're healthy people in general, and they happen to also cut out those foods because they believe them to be unhealthy. And it makes studying things so much harder in the long run because we have these preconceived ideas about health, so we make behavioral changes. Now it's not independent anymore. Your change was based on a preconceived idea. So that's where healthy user bias comes in. And that's why epidemiological research that's one of the flaws, and that's why we should be striving for more controlled clinical trials and research. We should be having more intervention studies to say, you eat this, and now the control group doesn't, but the test group now gets a single intervention, and we can study it from there. But as I mentioned, it's incredibly tricky to do that with nutrition because we can't lock people up for 10 years and perfectly control their diet.
Right. We're not lab animals, and even people have issues with how these poor animals are treated in these environments, but there's a reason why they have to do that, to try to have some sort of control. And I find that really interesting that you bring that up because, there's a lot of criticism in the MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again, from folks who are in the STEM world. They're like, oh, red dye, that's not a big deal. Oh, and we could talk about that back and forth. They say, sedentary rates are through the roof. Like, let's look at, some of these other factors, not just the colorings, the dyes, that sort of kind of crunchy wellness influence, but also the fact that folks aren't outside anymore. Folks are sitting down much more. There's all these other factors. So I do agree, and I appreciate that you bring that up because that does matter when we have this healthy bias. And I appreciate that you bring that up because it's really important for those of us who are in this crunchy world to know that we have a bias and that that's going to come out, and that doesn't again, you always want to make sure you're proving yourself wrong. Even if you firmly believe on what you believe to be true, if you and I both know we've been in this industry long enough, things are evolving and changing. Yeah. And just making sure, I think certainty in itself can be elusive. Like whenever we want to be like super certain about something, that I think is a human need. And so it makes sense we crave that. But I do think it's elusive more than we're willing to admit. What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. And I must say, after now the last few years of working with clients, I think I've become so much more humbled in my approach to nutrition. And I can't say that I prescribe to a diet camp anymore. I always used to feel the need to be like, I'm paleo, I'm low carb, I'm pro-metabolic, I'm, whatever. And now I really try as much as I can not to subscribe to this camp that so many people feel they need to subscribe to, because I realize that different things work for different people. And I have my beliefs about what I think an optimal diet is, but I look at the person in front of me, I look at the client in front of me, and if what they're eating is not working for them, we make changes. Regardless of what I think is going to be their best diet, it's what's working for them.
Yeah. So, bioindividuality is something that we've talked about with Nicole, integrative dietitian, on in the past. And so as we're closing down the conversation, I'll have links in the show notes about some of the topics we talked about, but you have a couple offerings for folks, like the Lazy Cookbook, which I love. You have a women's health course. You have a YouTube channel that has a couple cool topics that you guys have been launching. So you have some tools that people who want to work with you or want to learn more, that's in the show notes. But, how can someone approach nutrition research and try to make informed decisions about their food after, listening to this conversation? Like, how can they walk away feeling more confident? What would be some helpful tips you have for them?
Yeah, so I think I don't want to throw nutrition research down the drain because, it definitely serves a purpose. And I love nutrition research. I cite a lot of nutrition research. I love reading papers. So none of this is to say that we shouldn't look at papers. I think it's just important to look at them with context, and understanding of their flaws. So if you read a paper, I would say mark that as an interesting potential. It's not a definitive fact. It's something interesting to look into, and then go and test that on yourself. I think that's what we should be aiming for. Be our own researchers, collect our own data. So I do have quite a data-driven approach with my clients, and I think it's really helpful to collect your own data. So, I get that you also want that sort of intuitive sense and lean into like communicating with your body. But I think that data just really helps us even connect with our body better, is to actually, even just in a journal every day, collect some metrics on yourself. How is my mood today? How's my energy today? How's my digestion? How is my sleep? Just start collecting those metrics and whatever symptoms you're struggling with, and do some food tracking. I love using an app like Chronometer to start doing some food tracking. I don't think it has to be like this obsessive calorie controlled thing. Look at it more out of curiosity, and then you can start putting those pieces together. Now you've collected your own data, you can start analyzing relationships and looking for trends, saying, oh, wow, like, whenever I eat this for dinner, I don't sleep well. That's, you didn't need a study to tell you that. You've collected your own data. So I think we need to become our own researchers, collect your own data, learn to apply these studies to yourselves as an individual. And yeah, if you are wanting, to understand something from the research and you really want to understand that, what is the impact of this food long term, then I would say look for meta-analysis, because the good thing about meta-analysis is some of these negative effects will in a way be teased out, because say you've got 10 studies, they each have, certain potential confounding factors, but then put them together. If you're finding the same relationship again and again and again and again in different parts of the world and different studies and different researchers, then okay, there's potentially a link here. Meta-analysis also have their flaws, because if you take 10 terrible studies, you're going to get a terrible result. So also look at that with a pinch of salt. But I do think a meta-analysis can be a really helpful way just to collaborate the data the research that's been done on a particular topic.
Yeah, I think those are excellent tips. Meta-analysis is like kind of a bigger bird's eye view of like a bigger pool of studies, kind of more the cream of the crop. But doesn't mean it will be free from flaws, because it's just, like you said, a bird's eye view of all the flaws of the studies. And so the self-experimentation, that's a word we've used in season 2, was called biofeedback. Tracking stress. SHREDS is the acronym that I learned from my mentor, Sam Miller-Science. Whether that goes kind of against what me and you push, which getting shredded, but because we don't really advocate for that sort of lifestyle, especially if you want to balance your hormones or be fertile in regards to female physiology. But in defense of Sam Miller-Science, he always says that, it's not like our body's physiology is not like our iPhone. It doesn't get an upgrade with the stress that society puts on us. So the stress of low energy intake, like not eating enough specific nutrients, the stress of the emails and the long work hours, the stress of political climates, or all this stuff is coming at us. The body might see that as the threat of a tiger, or this law we talked about in a previous episode, the adaptation of stress and chronic stress and how that impacts the body. And so that's SHRED stands for sleep, hunger, recovery, energy, digestion, and stress. And that's just like a nice acronym to help remember some of the basics, but there's also mindset. And, you mentioned how your sleep is impacted because of what you ate, just having these little journals and noting that, because as you said, it's really easy to let that will slip by your memory. And what better way just to track and notice trends when you start to notice how you feel. That's in my own experience with my clients. I always noticed the body image was correlated with like a certain time of the month. People were going to be more bloated. Started seeing that as well. So you'll start to see trends within your body. And I think that's really empowering. And that's what me and you always align on, our education and empowerment. And I really appreciate you sharing those tips for those who are, nerds like us who like to read studies. And then if they want to just learn more, then I'll link all those show notes in the show notes for them. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close down the conversation?
Yeah, I agree with that. So the menstrual cycle, that's another great tracking point. And I think as women, we are so lucky that we have this. I've heard it being referred to as your monthly report card. So taking your basal body temperature every morning, that's another metric that I think is nice. It provides a bit more of an objective metric that we can track, and we can see, oh wow, this lifestyle habit is really affecting my temperatures and my menstrual cycle. And that's just another nice metric that we can use to just get more in tune with ourselves and be our own researchers.
Yeah, that's how we can tell if our food or exercise are working for us. We can tell if there's a dip in our basal metabolic temperature. I'll link more information in the show notes for those of you that might be a brand new concept to you, being like, what, taking my temperature, not just to see if I have a fever, and if you're done the fertility awareness method, you might be a little bit more in tune with the term basal temperature and tracking that. So thank you. And the last thing I want to ask is, when it comes to the body's report card, your period, I've heard your cycle that you just had is a combination of the last 90 days. Is that true? So it's not just what you did in the last month, but it could be the last couple months?
Yeah, it's got to do with the maturation of your egg that, takes longer than just a month. stress 3 months ago might show up as maybe a shorter cycle this month. So yeah, that's a good reminder that it's not necessarily what you did today or yesterday or this month, but the last 3 months might still be playing a role on your health today.
Yeah, and that's really helpful for if you have bad symptoms to not get hyper focused on right now or what you ate last night. It could be even a bigger picture. And so that's again, I'd always remind my clients like, okay, I know we're having like a really intense PMS. Let's take a breath. Let's look at the cycles. Let's look at the trends. And that's why it's helpful to hire a professional. And so I'll link all those information. Do you work with folks all over the world or just in South Africa?
Yeah, I've got clients in America, in the UK, in Australia.
Cool.
All over.
She's international, folks. Well, again, feel free to reach out if you want to learn more. And thank you so much for your time. And thank you guys for listening.
Thanks so much, Megan.
And that's all I have for you today, folks. Thanks again for listening. And please do check the show notes and the episode blog for lots more information to continue learning. So there's something I'd like to point out. We're about halfway through season 3, and there is a very common theme that is emerging as I'm finishing up all the interviews and getting them scheduled to drop week after week. And it is certainty and the craving for certainty, whether that's in institutions like nutrition or in science or in religion. And that is just so fascinating. So listeners, let me know if you are picking up on the trend of certainty, especially as we have the next couple weeks drop. So we have an interview with my dear friend Franklin, and we're going to be talking about bridging science and spirituality, which I touched on a little bit last week in the Dogma in Science, Health and Fitness and Spirituality episode. Then we have, oh my gosh, another dear friend of mine, Leah Denton, and she hosts the podcast Psychotherapist, talking about therapy harm and the psycho in the therapy chair. She's also going to share a little bit more about her faith deconstruction journey and what she's also experienced in the deconstruction ex-Christian community that I often discuss here on the podcast. Of course, I've got some solo episodes for you. I want to talk about social media addiction because, hello, the TikTok ban for like less than 24 hours was an absolute meltdown, and that was embarrassing for those involved. And I recently read a book at the end of last year called The Social Media Shift by Carly Burr, and I have invited her on the podcast. Haven't heard back. Would love to break down her book, but that's going to be really a big influence on the discussion I have for you. And then I also want to talk about the power of self-talk and the brain reframe. It's a part of the 365 Easy Challenge. I've got old blogs and content I've put up on Instagram, and I just want to dedicate an entire podcast episode to it. I don't know exactly when, probably sometime late February, March, I don't know, somewhere around there. Last but not least, by any means, I have Connie A. Baker, and she's going to be talking about spiritual and religious abuse in her incredible book that I read last year, and I just cannot wait for that episode to drop. It is so powerful, so insightful for any of us who have gone through a faith deconstruction or any sort of religious or spiritual trauma. That interview is for you. And then I just sat down and recorded this just last night as I'm here with you, which is on the 24th of January. My dear friend Sloan Wilson from Exodus Cry, which works with sex trafficking and sexual exploitation and the sex trade, it was a very powerful conversation. And some of you may know that I have experience in the sex industry. I worked as a high-end prostitute, an escort, a sugar baby, whatever you want to call it. And I have a lot to say about this topic. And it's not all positive. And I have a lot to say about the progressive ideologies that really cater to saying that sex work is real work, because I'm going to have to disagree with that. So we've had a really great conversation just witnessing deconstruction as she was a part of the IHOP scandal and just nonprofit advocacy. So we have a lot of great stuff coming for you, if you can tell. So if you have yet to leave me a 5-star review, I still have some haters that like to drop 1-star reviews. Like, why? I just don't think this podcast is a 1-star. If you want to engage with my ideas, you don't agree with me, how about you send me an email and let's chat? Don't be a dick. So yeah, 5-star reviews would be rad. Please send it to a friend, share it, post about it, tag me on Instagram. Hit me up on X, Substack. I want to hear from you guys. I really do. I prefer an exchange of ideas, a conversation, perhaps maybe even an acquaintance, or we can make a friendship out of this. Wouldn't that be cool? So until then, maintain your curiosity, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. Have a great week.